Spirit versus flesh, the struggle you can't escape. There is a battle happening inside you every single day, whether you are aware of it or not. It is not a symbolic struggle, nor a poetic metaphor designed to inspire sermons. It is real, constant, and decisive. This conflict determines how you think, how you act, what you desire, and ultimately who controls your life. The ancient scriptures describe it simply yet profoundly: spirit versus flesh. Most people try to escape this truth. They distract themselves, numb their conscience, or reinterpret spiritual language to make it more comfortable. But the struggle does not disappear just because it is ignored. In fact, it grows stronger in silence. The flesh never rests. It does not negotiate. It demands, pressures, and deceives. The spirit, on the other hand, does not force. It invites, guides, and waits. This is why so many believers feel exhausted, confused, and spiritually weak. They believe in God, they pray, they attend church, yet internally they feel defeated. They wonder why peace feels temporary, why discipline collapses so easily, why old patterns keep returning. The answer is uncomfortable but simple. The flesh is winning more daily battles than they realize. This series is not designed to entertain you. It is designed to confront you, to expose what most teachings avoid, to bring clarity where confusion has become normal. If you truly want freedom, growth, and spiritual authority, you must understand this struggle in its rawest form, not emotionally, not motivationally, but truthfully. The war between spirit and flesh is not optional. You cannot opt out. You are either consciously fighting it or unconsciously losing it. And the cost of losing is far greater than most people imagine. Why the struggle between spirit and flesh is unavoidable. The conflict between spirit and flesh exists because they operate from opposite principles, with opposite goals and opposite outcomes. This is not a matter of personality, upbringing, or environment. It is a structural reality of human existence. From the moment you became aware of good and evil, this struggle began, and it will continue as long as you live in this body. The flesh is not merely the physical body. This is one of the most misunderstood concepts in modern spirituality. The flesh refers to the fallen nature that seeks autonomy from God. It craves control, comfort, validation, pleasure, and security on its own terms. The flesh does not necessarily want evil in obvious forms. Often it wants good things for the wrong reasons, at the wrong time, and in the wrong order. The spirit, by contrast, is aligned with truth, obedience, surrender, and eternal perspective. It seeks transformation, not indulgence, discipline, not impulse, purpose, not momentary relief. This is why the two are constantly at odds. They cannot coexist peacefully because they respond to entirely different authorities. Many believers assume that once they accept faith, the flesh weakens automatically. This assumption leads to deep frustration. When temptation persists, they feel guilt. When old habits resurface, they feel shame. When progress feels slow, they assume something is wrong with them. But nothing is wrong. The struggle is evidence that something is right. The flesh resists the spirit precisely because the spirit threatens its dominance. Every time you choose discipline over impulse, truth over comfort, obedience over desire, the flesh loses territory. And it does not surrender quietly. It fights back through rationalization, distraction, emotional fatigue, and spiritual numbness. One of the most dangerous lies circulating today is the idea that peace means the absence of struggle. In reality, peace is not the absence of conflict, but clarity about who you are obeying within the conflict. Even the strongest believers experienced intense internal battles. What set them apart was not the absence of temptation, but the refusal to surrender to it. Another reason this struggle is unavoidable is because growth requires resistance. Without resistance, muscles weaken. Without opposition, discipline decays. The flesh provides resistance not because it is useful, but because overcoming it strengthens the spirit. This is why moments of temptation often appear right after spiritual breakthroughs. The flesh reacts when it senses loss of control. The modern world unintentionally strengthens the flesh. Constant stimulation, instant gratification, endless entertainment, and emotional comfort culture train people to obey impulses immediately. Patience feels unnatural. Silence feels uncomfortable. Discipline feels oppressive. In such an environment, walking in the Spirit requires intentional resistance against the current of society. Avoiding this struggle does not make you peaceful, it makes you passive. And passivity is the flesh's greatest ally. When you stop consciously choosing the Spirit, the flesh does not wait for permission. It fills the vacuum automatically. This is why spiritual life cannot be lived on autopilot. Neutrality does not exist in this battle. Every decision, every thought pattern, every reaction strengthens one side. Even small compromises accumulate. Even silent victories matter. Understanding that this struggle is unavoidable removes confusion and replaces it with responsibility. You stop asking, "Why am I struggling?" and start asking, "Who am I feeding?" The Spirit grows through attention, obedience, and discipline. The flesh grows through indulgence, distraction, and neglect of truth. This realization is uncomfortable, but liberating. Because once you accept that the battle will not end, you stop waiting for perfect conditions and start building daily strength. You stop chasing emotional highs and start cultivating consistency. You stop blaming circumstances and start taking ownership. The struggle between spirit and flesh is not a punishment. It is the training ground of transformation. Those who understand this stop running from the battle and start winning it quietly, daily, and decisively. If this message is resonating with you, it means you are becoming aware of the battle rather than being controlled by it. Before we continue to the next topic, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. These teachings are not surface-level motivation. They are tools for real spiritual strength. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next part of this series, where we will expose how the flesh subtly takes control of your thoughts without you noticing. How the flesh quietly takes control of your daily life. The flesh rarely announces itself loudly. It does not usually arrive with obvious rebellion or dramatic moral collapse. Instead, it advances subtly, patiently, and intelligently, often disguised as normal behavior, reasonable choices, or even self-care. This is what makes it so dangerous. Most believers do not lose their spiritual strength through one catastrophic failure, but through thousands of small, unexamined decisions that slowly shift authority away from the Spirit. One of the primary ways the flesh gains control is through familiarity. When something becomes routine, it stops being questioned. The flesh thrives in routines that are never examined spiritually. You wake up, check your phone, scroll, consume information, react emotionally, rush through the day, exhaust your mind, and collapse at night. None of this feels sinful. None of it feels rebellious, yet over time it trains the mind to live reactively rather than intentionally. The Spirit operates through awareness. The flesh operates through habit. Another strategy the flesh uses is urgency. Everything feels immediate. Every desire demands instant response. Hunger must be satisfied now. Anger must be expressed now. Comfort must be restored now. Rest must be taken now. The flesh convinces you that delay is unnecessary and discipline is oppressive. The Spirit, however, works through patience, restraint, and timing. When urgency dominates your decisions, the flesh is already winning. The flesh also takes control through emotional reasoning. Feelings become the compass. If something feels heavy, it must be avoided. If something feels uncomfortable, it must be wrong. If something feels good, it must be acceptable. This is subtle because emotions are real, but they were never designed to be rulers. The flesh elevates emotion to authority. while the spirit asks for discernment beyond emotion. Over time, emotional reasoning reshapes beliefs. People stop asking, "Is this true?" and start asking, "How does this make me feel?" Truth becomes negotiable. Conviction becomes optional. Discomfort becomes intolerable. The flesh does not need to deny God outright. It only needs to redefine obedience as unnecessary when it feels inconvenient. Distraction is another powerful weapon. The flesh does not always pull you toward obvious wrongdoing. Often it simply keeps you busy. Busy minds do not reflect. Busy lives do not listen. Busy hearts do not discern. When there is no silence, the Spirit's guidance becomes harder to perceive. This is why many people say God feels distant when, in reality, their lives have become too loud. Constant stimulation numbs spiritual sensitivity. Endless content, constant notifications, background noise and mental clutter slowly weaken the ability to sit still with truth. The flesh thrives on stimulation because stimulation replaces reflection. Reflection leads to conviction. Conviction leads to change. The flesh wants none of that. Another subtle way the flesh takes control is through compromise masked as balance. People tell themselves they are being realistic, moderate, or flexible. They relax standards just enough to feel comfortable, but not enough to feel guilty. This creates a dangerous middle ground where conscience becomes dull, but pride remains intact. The flesh loves this space because it avoids both conviction and repentance. The flesh also manipulates identity. It whispers that you are defined by your past, your struggles, your personality, or your weaknesses. This is just how I am. I've always been like this. I can't change. These thoughts feel honest, but they quietly deny transformation. The Spirit speaks of renewal and growth. The flesh insists on permanence of limitation. Fatigue is another gateway. When the body and mind are exhausted, resistance weakens. Discipline feels impossible. Discernment fades. Decisions become impulsive. The flesh knows this and often pushes people toward overextension, poor rest, and mental overload, not to destroy them instantly, but to soften resistance gradually. The flesh also uses comparison. Looking at others becomes a measure of self-worth. Envy grows, pride grows, contentment fades, gratitude disappears. Comparison keeps attention outward instead of inward. While you are focused on others, you stop noticing what is happening inside your own heart. The flesh loves external focus because it avoids self-examination. Another overlooked method is spiritual familiarity. When spiritual language becomes routine, it loses impact. Scripture is read without engagement, prayer becomes repetitive, worship becomes mechanical. The flesh does not need to eliminate spiritual practices. It only needs to drain them of meaning. Ritual without presence feels spiritual but produces no transformation. The flesh also distorts freedom. It presents freedom as the absence of restriction. Do what you want, follow your desires, express yourself fully. But true freedom is not the absence of boundaries. It is the ability to choose what is right, even when it is difficult. The flesh promises freedom while creating dependency. The Spirit offers discipline while producing peace. Over time, these small influences accumulate. The person still believes, still prays occasionally, still identifies as spiritual, but internally obedience has weakened, sensitivity has dulled, resistance has faded. The flesh does not need complete domination. Partial control is enough to neutralize spiritual power. This is why many believers feel stuck. They are not falling dramatically, but they are not growing either. They are spiritually busy but inwardly stagnant. The flesh has not destroyed their faith, it has diluted it. Recognizing these patterns is not meant to produce guilt, it is meant to restore clarity. Awareness is the first act of resistance. Once you see how the flesh operates, its power decreases. Light exposes strategy. Truth disrupts deception. The Spirit does not demand perfection. It invites alignment. Small daily choices restore authority. Silence creates space. Discipline strengthens clarity. Obedience rebuilds trust. The flesh loses ground when it is no longer fed automatically. If you are beginning to recognize these patterns in your own life, this awareness itself is a sign of awakening. The next step is learning how to starve the flesh and strengthen the spirit intentionally, which we will explore in the next topic. Before we continue, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. These teachings are designed to help you regain spiritual clarity and strength step by step. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next part of this series, where we will uncover how to weaken the flesh and restore spiritual authority in daily life. How the spirit is strengthened through daily invisible choices. The spirit does not grow through dramatic moments alone. It is not strengthened primarily in emotional highs, powerful gatherings, or intense breakthroughs, although those moments can awaken awareness. The spirit is formed, trained, and established through daily, invisible choices that most people overlook. This is why many believers chase spiritual intensity but never develop spiritual stability. They want fire without discipline, power without submission, and victory without consistency. The spirit operates quietly. It does not compete for attention the way the flesh does. While the flesh demands immediate satisfaction, the spirit waits for permission. It respects order. It moves through alignment rather than force. This is why strengthening the spirit requires intention. If you only respond to what is loud, urgent, or emotionally intense, you will naturally follow the flesh, because the flesh is aggressive and persuasive. The spirit grows when you choose what is right, even when nothing dramatic happens afterward. One of the most important truths to understand is that the spirit is strengthened by obedience, not by knowledge alone. Many people confuse information with transformation. They listen to sermons, read books, and consume spiritual content daily, yet their inner life remains unchanged. This happens because obedience engages the will, while knowledge often stops at the intellect. The flesh can tolerate information. It cannot tolerate obedience. Every time you obey the spirit in small things, you expand its influence. This includes choosing silence instead of unnecessary speech, restraint instead of impulse, patience instead of reaction, humility instead of self-defense. These moments feel insignificant, but they are foundational. The spirit grows through alignment with truth, not through emotional excitement. Another way the spirit is strengthened is through intentional stillness. Stillness is not inactivity, it is attentiveness. When you remove noise, the spirit becomes clearer. Many people avoid stillness because it exposes inattention, unresolved thoughts, and uncomfortable convictions. The flesh dislikes stillness because it removes distraction. The spirit uses stillness to refine awareness. Daily moments of quiet reflection recalibrate the inner compass. They allow truth to surface without resistance. They create space for discernment. Over time, stillness trains the mind to listen rather than react. This weakens the flesh's control because reaction is one of its primary tools. Discipline also plays a critical role. Discipline is often misunderstood as restriction, but spiritually, discipline is alignment. It is choosing what serves long-term growth over short-term comfort. The flesh interprets discipline as punishment. The spirit recognizes it as freedom. When you discipline your time, your attention, your body, and your thoughts, you are not suppressing yourself. You are directing yourself. The spirit is strengthened when priorities are clarified. Many believers struggle not because they are rebellious, but because they are scattered. Their attention is divided, their energy is diluted, their focus is constantly shifting. The spirit thrives in order. When you simplify your life, remove unnecessary distractions, and establish clear rhythms, the spirit gains stability. Consistency matters more than intensity. A small daily practice done faithfully produces far more transformation than occasional extreme effort. This is why the Spirit responds to routine alignment, daily prayer, daily reflection, daily self-examination, daily acts of obedience. These form a structure the Spirit can operate within. The flesh resists routine because routine exposes inconsistency. Another essential factor is truth-based thinking. The Spirit strengthens the mind by renewing it. This renewal does not happen automatically. Thoughts must be examined, beliefs must be challenged, assumptions must be questioned. The flesh thrives on unchecked thoughts, especially those rooted in fear, insecurity, pride, or desire. The Spirit grows when thoughts are brought into alignment with truth rather than emotion. Emotional control is another area where the Spirit gains authority. This does not mean suppressing emotion, but governing it. When emotions dictate behavior, the flesh is in control. When emotions are acknowledged but not obeyed blindly, the Spirit leads. This requires awareness, patience, and restraint. Over time, emotional discipline produces inner peace and clarity. The Spirit is also strengthened through intentional resistance. Temptation itself is not failure. Surrender is. Every time you resist an impulse that contradicts truth, you strengthen spiritual muscle. Resistance builds endurance. Endurance builds authority. Authority builds confidence. This is why temptation often increases when spiritual growth begins. Resistance is training, not punishment. Another overlooked factor is gratitude. Gratitude reorients the heart. It shifts focus from lack to provision, from desire to sufficiency, from anxiety to trust. The flesh thrives on dissatisfaction. The Spirit thrives on gratitude. When gratitude becomes habitual, contentment grows, and the flesh loses leverage. Community also plays a role, but only when it encourages accountability, rather than comfort. The Spirit grows in environments where truth is valued over approval, where correction is welcomed, where honesty is practiced. The flesh prefers environments that affirm without challenging. Discernment is required even in spiritual communities. The Spirit is strengthened when identity is rooted in truth rather than performance. When your worth is not dependent on success, approval, or perfection, fear loses power. The flesh manipulates fear to control behavior. The Spirit operates from security. Knowing who you are reduces vulnerability to manipulation. Time is another key factor. The Spirit works through process. Growth unfolds gradually. Impatience weakens spiritual development because it creates pressure to perform rather than align. The flesh is impatient. The Spirit is patient. Trusting the process strengthens endurance. Failure, when handled correctly, also strengthens the Spirit. Failure becomes destructive only when it leads to shame. When failure leads to humility, learning and recommitment, it produces growth. The flesh uses failure to accuse and discourage. The Spirit uses it to refine and teach. The Spirit is strengthened when responsibility is accepted. Blame weakens growth. Ownership strengthens it. When you stop blaming circumstances, people, or past experiences and take responsibility for your inner life, authority returns. The Spirit thrives where responsibility is embraced. Over time, these daily invisible choices accumulate. The Spirit becomes stronger not because the flesh disappears, but because its influence diminishes. The struggle remains, but the balance shifts. What once felt overwhelming becomes manageable. What once controlled you loses power. This transformation does not make life easier externally. It makes you stronger internally. Challenges remain, but clarity increases. Temptation continues, but resistance improves. The Spirit becomes the dominant influence, not through force, but through consistent alignment. If you are beginning to sense this shift, understand that it is not accidental. It is the result of countless small decisions aligning you with truth. Continue choosing intentionally. Continue resisting quietly. Continue aligning daily. Before we move forward, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. The next topic will expose the hidden cost of letting the flesh remain in control and why delayed obedience always produces deeper consequences. Subscribe now so you don't miss what comes next. The hidden cost of letting the flesh remain in control. When the flesh remains in control for long periods, the damage is rarely immediate or dramatic. That is why it is so dangerous. The consequences unfold slowly, quietly, and invisibly, shaping a life that looks functional on the outside but feels hollow, heavy, and conflicted on the inside. Many people assume that as long as they avoid obvious wrongdoing, there is no real cost to living according to impulse, emotion, and comfort. This assumption is one of the most destructive spiritual errors a person can make. The first hidden cost of fleshly control is the erosion of spiritual sensitivity. Sensitivity is the ability to perceive conviction, discern truth, and respond to guidance. When the flesh dominates, this sensitivity dulls. Not suddenly, but gradually, what once felt wrong begins to feel neutral. What once stirred conviction becomes tolerable. The inner alarm system grows quiet. This does not mean conscience disappears. It means it becomes easier to ignore. As sensitivity weakens, discernment follows. Discernment is the ability to distinguish between what is good and what is merely appealing. The flesh is skilled at offering alternatives that look harmless, reasonable, or even beneficial. Without discernment, people make choices that align with desire rather than truth, comfort rather than growth, ease rather than purpose. Over time, life becomes reactive instead of intentional. Another hidden cost is internal division. When the flesh rules, the inner life becomes fragmented. One part of you knows what is right, another part resists doing it. This creates tension, fatigue, and inner noise. People describe this as feeling conflicted, tired without reason, or restless even when circumstances are calm. This inner division drains energy because the mind and will are constantly negotiating instead of aligning. The flesh also erodes clarity of purpose. Purpose requires direction, commitment, and sacrifice. The flesh resists all three. It prefers flexibility, options, and comfort. As a result, people drift. They start many things but finish few. They feel called but not committed, inspired but inconsistent. This produces frustration and self-doubt. The problem is not lack of ability, it is lack of alignment. Delayed obedience is another major cost. The flesh rarely says never. It says later. Later becomes tomorrow. Tomorrow becomes next month becomes years. Delayed obedience slowly hardens resistance. What could have been a simple step becomes a heavy burden. The longer obedience is postponed, the more intimidating it feels. Opportunities pass, windows close, momentum fades. Relationships also suffer under fleshly control. The flesh is self-centered by nature. Even when it appears generous, it seeks validation, control, or comfort in return. This creates shallow connections, unspoken expectations, and quiet resentment. The spirit produces self-giving love. The flesh produces transactional relationships. Over time, people feel lonely even when surrounded by others. Another hidden cost is the weakening of spiritual authority. Authority is not dominance over others. It is stability within oneself. When the flesh controls behavior, authority diminishes. Words lose weight. Decisions lack conviction. Confidence becomes fragile. People may speak truth, but it carries little impact because their inner life contradicts their message. Authority flows from alignment, not from position. Fear also increases under fleshly control. The flesh thrives on fear because fear justifies self-protection, fear of loss, fear of rejection, fear of discomfort, fear of change. These fears shape decisions subtly. People avoid growth because it feels risky. They avoid truth because it feels threatening. They avoid surrender because it feels unsafe. The spirit operates from trust. The flesh operates from fear. Over time, anxiety becomes normalized, stress becomes constant, peace feels temporary. This is not because life is inherently overwhelming, but because the flesh cannot produce rest. It demands constant management, constant reassurance, constant stimulation. The spirit produces rest even in difficulty. The flesh produces exhaustion even in ease. Another cost is the distortion of identity. When the flesh dominates, identity becomes performance-based. People define themselves by success, failure, approval, or productivity. This creates instability. When things go well, confidence rises. When things fail, worth collapses. The spirit offers stable identity rooted in truth rather than outcome. Without this, emotional swings intensify. The flesh also undermines resilience. Resilience is the ability to endure discomfort without losing direction. The flesh avoids discomfort at all costs. As a result, tolerance for hardship decreases. Small challenges feel overwhelming. Criticism feels crushing. Delay feels unbearable. Life becomes fragile. The spirit builds endurance through patience and trust. Another often overlooked cost is spiritual stagnation. People stop growing but remain busy. They attend, consume, listen, and discuss, but nothing changes. Familiar language replaces lived transformation. Spiritual life becomes theoretical rather than experiential. This produces boredom and disillusionment. People assume the problem is faith itself, when the real issue is fleshly dominance. Joy also diminishes. Not happiness, but deep joy. Joy comes from alignment with purpose. The flesh offers pleasure, but pleasure is temporary and dependent on conditions. When pleasure fades, emptiness returns. The spirit produces joy that remains even when circumstances fluctuate. Without it, people chase stimulation endlessly. The flesh also weakens moral courage. Courage requires conviction. Conviction requires clarity. Clarity requires alignment. When the flesh dominates, people avoid standing for truth if it costs comfort or approval. Silence replaces integrity. Compromise replaces conviction. Over time, self-respect erodes. Delayed consequences accumulate quietly. One compromise leads to another. One avoidance leads to habit. One habit shapes character. Character shapes destiny. The flesh does not ruin lives overnight. It reshapes them gradually into something smaller than they were meant to be. Perhaps the greatest hidden cost is spiritual distance. Not because the spirit leaves, but because awareness fades. People feel disconnected, dry, or empty. They try to fix this with more activity instead of deeper alignment, but connection is restored through surrender, not stimulation. Understanding these costs is not meant to produce fear. It is meant to awaken urgency, not panic, but seriousness. The flesh is not neutral. It always takes something in exchange for comfort. The longer it rules, the more it demands. The good news is that recognition restores choice. The moment you see the cost, you regain power. The spirit does not condemn, it invites return. Alignment can be restored, authority can be rebuilt, sensitivity can be renewed. But delay deepens cost. Awareness without response strengthens resistance. Knowing truth without acting on it trains disobedience. This is why immediate alignment matters. Not perfection, but direction. If you recognize yourself in these patterns, understand this. Awareness is not accidental. It is an invitation to reclaim control from the flesh and restore spiritual order. Before we continue to the final topic, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. The next part will show how to establish lasting spiritual dominance and live with clarity, discipline, and peace despite the ongoing struggle. Subscribe now so you don't miss the conclusion of this series. How to establish lasting spiritual dominance in a world that constantly feeds the flesh. Establishing lasting spiritual dominance does not mean eliminating the flesh, silencing desire forever, or reaching a state where struggle no longer exists. That expectation itself is one of the most damaging misconceptions in spiritual life. Dominance is not the absence of conflict. It is clarity of authority within the conflict. It is knowing, moment by moment, who governs your decisions when pressure, temptation, fear, or fatigue arise. Many people believe they have lost spiritually because the struggle continues, when in reality, the struggle continues precisely because growth is happening. Lasting spiritual dominance begins with accepting that the flesh will always attempt to reclaim control. It never retires. It never evolves into obedience. It only adapts its strategies. When people assume they have outgrown the flesh, they become careless. Carelessness is not freedom, it is vulnerability. Spiritual dominance is maintained through vigilance, not anxiety, but awareness. You do not fear the flesh, you recognize it. One of the most critical foundations of dominance is internal honesty. The spirit cannot govern what is constantly denied. Many believers delay growth because they hide from themselves. They rationalize patterns, rename weaknesses, and excuse repeated behaviors as personality traits or circumstances. The flesh thrives in self-deception. The spirit grows where truth is faced without theatrics or shame. Honest self-examination is not condemnation. It is alignment. Dominance also requires redefining success. If success is defined by comfort, pleasure, ease, or approval, the flesh will always lead. The spirit defines success as faithfulness, alignment, obedience, and growth. This shift in definition changes how decisions are evaluated. You stop asking whether something feels good and start asking whether it strengthens clarity, discipline, and purpose. This alone dismantles much of the flesh's influence. Another essential element is mastery of attention. What you repeatedly focus on shapes what you obey. The flesh hijacks attention through noise, stimulation, urgency, and emotional intensity. The spirit strengthens focus through intentional direction. Attention is not neutral, it is nourishment. Whatever consistently holds your attention will eventually shape your desires. This is why guarding attention is one of the highest forms of discipline. Spiritual dominance also requires restructuring daily rhythms. Growth does not occur in chaos. The spirit thrives in order, rhythm, and intentional repetition. This does not mean rigid schedules or perfection, but it does mean consistency. When prayer, reflection, discipline, and silence are optional, they become rare. When they are built into daily rhythm, they become formative. The flesh resists rhythm because rhythm limits impulse. Another critical aspect is learning to endure discomfort without interpreting it as failure. The flesh equates discomfort with danger. The spirit understands discomfort as training. Growth always stretches capacity. Silence feels uncomfortable before it becomes peaceful. Discipline feels restrictive before it becomes freeing. Obedience feels heavy before it becomes natural. Those who quit during discomfort never experience dominance because they retreat at the point of formation. Spiritual dominance also depends on emotional governance. Emotions are powerful, but they are not leaders. When emotions dictate behavior, the flesh has authority. When emotions are acknowledged but not obeyed blindly, the spirit governs. This requires patience and restraint. You learn to pause before reacting, to feel without surrendering control, to observe emotion without becoming enslaved by it. Over time, emotional stability replaces volatility. Another often ignored factor is delayed gratification. The flesh is addicted to immediacy. It wants relief now, affirmation now, pleasure now. The Spirit builds strength through waiting. Waiting develops trust. Trust develops endurance. Endurance develops authority. Every time you delay gratification in alignment with truth, you weaken the flesh's grip and strengthen spiritual control. Language also plays a role. The way you speak internally shapes obedience. Constant self-accusation weakens resolve. Constant self-justification strengthens the flesh. The Spirit speaks truth without cruelty and grace without excuses. Learning to speak truthfully to yourself without drama or denial stabilizes identity and direction. Spiritual dominance also requires boundaries. Boundaries are not limitations, they are protections. The flesh resists boundaries because boundaries restrict access to impulse. The Spirit values boundaries because they preserve clarity. This includes boundaries with media, relationships, conversations, environments, and even thoughts. Without boundaries, discipline collapses under pressure. Another vital element is surrender of control. This may seem paradoxical, but spiritual dominance increases as ego dominance decreases. The flesh wants control because it fears uncertainty. The Spirit operates through trust. Surrender does not mean passivity. It means alignment with truth beyond personal preference. Those who surrender wisely gain authority over what once controlled them. Dominance is also sustained through remembrance. Forgetting truth weakens resistance. Remembering truth strengthens resolve. This is why reflection matters. You remember past victories, past lessons, past consequences. You do not romanticize failure or minimize cost. Memory becomes instruction. The flesh relies on forgetfulness. The Spirit thrives on remembrance. Community, when chosen wisely, reinforces dominance. Not communities that avoid truth to preserve comfort, but communities that value honesty, accountability, and growth. Isolation weakens discernment. The flesh thrives when there is no external reflection. The Spirit strengthens where truth is mirrored and challenged respectfully. Spiritual dominance also involves accepting responsibility for your inner life fully. Blaming circumstances, people, trauma, or timing delays authority. Responsibility restores it. This does not deny difficulty or pain. It simply acknowledges agency. You cannot control everything that happens to you, but you are responsible for how you respond internally. Authority begins there. Over time, dominance changes how struggle feels. Temptation does not disappear, but it loses urgency. Desire does not vanish, but it loses command. Emotion does not fade, but it loses control. The flesh still speaks, but its voice weakens. The Spirit does not shout louder, it becomes clearer. This produces a quiet confidence, not arrogance. Stability. Decisions become simpler. Direction becomes clearer. Peace becomes less dependent on circumstances. Discipline becomes less forced. Obedience becomes less dramatic. Life does not become perfect, but it becomes ordered. Importantly, dominance is maintained. Not achieved once. It is a posture, not a destination. Complacency invites regression. Awareness sustains progress. This is not exhausting. It becomes natural over time. Just as habits form unconsciously, discipline can become instinctive. The ultimate outcome of spiritual dominance is freedom. Not freedom to indulge, but freedom to choose. Freedom from compulsion. Freedom from fear-driven decisions. Freedom from emotional tyranny. Freedom to live intentionally rather than reactively. This does not make life easier externally. It makes you stronger internally. Challenges continue, but they no longer define you. Pressure remains, but it no longer controls you. The struggle continues, but the outcome changes. If you have followed this series carefully, understand this. The battle between spirit and flesh will never stop, but it no longer has to be equal. Authority can shift, control can change, peace can deepen. The question is no longer whether the struggle exists. The question is who governs when it does. Before ending this series, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. These teachings are designed to equip you with clarity, discipline, and lasting spiritual strength. Subscribe now so you continue walking this path with understanding, stability, and purpose.